good afternoon, and happy Sunday. My name is Amanda Sutton, and I'm the Events and Marketing Director for Bookworks, your 36-year-old independent bookstore in the North Valley of Albuquerque. We are now open back up for business. You can come visit us Tuesday through Saturday from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can also shop online on our website 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That website is our name without the O's, so it's bkwrks.com. All right, during the pandemic, we've been doing virtual author events. This is number 103 for me. Number 102 was about 2 hours ago, talking locomotive history of Albuquerque. And now we've shifted gears, so to speak, to talk about another very important topic and one of my favorite topics, women in science. We're very pleased to be here today with Anna Reeser and Leila McNeill. These two met while graduate students at the University of Oklahoma. They both adore popular writing for history, and they're very pleased to be presenting their book to you today. The book is Forces of Nature, The Women Who Changed Science. You can buy this book from Bookworks, of course, and your purchases help us keep this event train moving along, help keep us in business. Thank you so much for supporting us during the pandemic with your orders. We're so excited to be open back up for browsing. So again, you can come visit us Tuesday through Saturday from 9 to 4. Please do bring a mask. Masks are still required in our shop. All right, so I'm going to drop the link to this book in the chat. You can also put your questions there. Let us know what questions you have as these two present their book. You can also tell us where you're from. Always kind of a fun thing to do to see where folks are tuning in from. I'm in Victory Hills, Albuquerque, South Albuquerque near UNM. I know Anna Reeser is tuning in also from Albuquerque, and Leila is joining us from Dallas, Texas. All right, let me tell you a little bit about our authors, and then we'll launch right into it. So Anna Reeser is an American historian of science and technology. She has a PhD in the history of science, technology, and medicine from the University of Oklahoma, where she is a postdoc. She is the co-founder and co-editor with Leila McNeill of Lady Science Magazine, which I hear is also a podcast. Anna's writing has appeared in The Atlantic, Real Life, StarTrek.com, Technology Stories, and more. Then we've got Leila McNeill, her friend and fellow doctoral recipient from the University of Oklahoma. Leila is also the co-founder and co-editor of Lady Science, and she is a columnist for Smithsonian.com and BBC Future. She's also been published in The Atlantic, as well as The Baffler and JSTOR. And I believe she may have some other writings in progress that she will tell us about later, perhaps. Leila, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about this awesome new book of yours, Forces of Nature.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm Leila, and this book is a history of women in science from the ancient world to the present day. And we focus on putting women scientists in their historical context and better understanding their immense contributions to science, technology, and medicine.
I'm Anna, and so today we want to just talk a little bit about what's in the book and what we focused on writing it, and we welcome your questions at the end. Put those in the chat for us. But yeah, let's tell you a little bit about the book. So the introduction of the book deals with how we think about silence in the history of women in science. So I think we hear a lot about how women were hidden or overlooked. And in sometimes in places that absolutely was true. And in sometimes in places, women were actively prevented from participating in science. But many women were absolutely central to the development of scientific disciplines. And some of them were quite famous in their own time. So people like that and others, many have only been silenced after the fact by neglect or sometimes a deliberate omission from our understanding of the development of science. And more than that, even those women who were not famous or even particularly sort of notable in their own time do actually, I think, put the lie to the idea that women were just scarce in the long history of science and only became scientists and investigators of nature in the modern period. So we focus on the whole history from antiquity to the present. It's a big span of time.
Yeah, and with this book, we wanted to offer readers an alternative to those compilations, those biographical compilations, where it's just a book of like 50, short profiles of really famous women. And we wanted to offer readers something that goes beyond those usual well-known figures that frequently pop up on those listicles of unsung women in science. We wanted to place these women in their historical and cultural context alongside other women of their time period to show readers that women's participation in science, technology, and medicine is not as anomalous as books of single biographies might make them seem. Each chapter is an essay that examines a group of women. Sometimes they knew each other and sometimes they didn't. All of these women labored in the realm of science in a different way than what we might think of as traditional science. We cover the wives and sisters of scientific partners with men. We cover 19th century women popularizers of science, domestic scientists, international women physicians, and many, many more.
So just an example from the book, there is a chapter titled Women Archaeologists and Anthropologists Humanize Their Past. And in that chapter, we tell the stories of Mexican-American archaeologist Zelia Nuttall and Seneca anthropologist Bertha Parker. And both of these women studied their own heritage and history and through their science in anthropology and archaeology. And in doing so, they were actually able to change the narratives that white Europeans and Americans had always told about ancient Mexican peoples and Native Americans. And neither of these women were professionally trained. They didn't have university degrees. And so one of the things that's important for us is that I think it's not enough to just sort of publish a bunch of listicles about unsung women in science. We have to kind of understand the culture of science that these women were working in and against for us to kind of fully understand their significance. And so in the case of Nuttall and Parker, what they were specifically kind of agitating against by doing science were these narratives that the cultures that they came from were full of, savages and were underdeveloped. And they were able, by studying their own cultures, to kind of overturn those narratives and change the way that people in Mexico and that when indigenous people thought about themselves and their own history. And I think that that's something that's really incredible, especially when we think about, who gets to do this kind of work. And neither of them had degrees.
Yeah. And one of the other kind of groups of women that you'll find in this book is women who weren't necessarily great people. And I think one of the things that we might be used to in some of the things that we might read about women in science is that they are often kind of a glorifying, glowing profile of a woman and her work. And I think that does somewhat of a disservice to science, to understanding the way science has come to be and the way science is performed, but also to our understanding of history. Because there were women scientists, just like there were male scientists that contributed to oppressive systems of science, colonization, exploitation of indigenous land. and indigenous people. And so we do include women like that in the book so that we can get a fuller understanding of this past and of science. And one of the women that we talk about is Maria Sabila Marion. She sailed to Dutch Suriname in 1699. Dutch Suriname was located in South America. And she went there to pursue her work as a naturalist and illustrator, an incredibly talented woman. And it was from the collections of plants, insects, animals, and natural wonders of the Dutch Empire that Marion was able to do her voyage, was able to travel halfway around the world. And it was also, she financed the journey herself by selling steaks in the book that she produced from her observations of the insects and flora there in Suriname. And Marion relied heavily, and this is in the book, she doesn't shy away from this part. This is how normal this was, a normal way to do science. She relied on the knowledge and resources of indigenous and enslaved people to create her now celebrated and very lavishly illustrated masterpiece, The Metamorphosis of Insects of Suriname. And when her research was completed, she actually returned to the Netherlands with an enslaved girl that she never named. She just referred to her in her diaries as Mijn Slaven. And so like the male naturalists and explorers of her time, she leveraged the power and resources of empire, including the institution of slavery. So one does not always need to own slaves to benefit from the practice. And to accomplish something few women were able to do before the 20th century. And so one of the things that we noticed when approaching the story of Marion and other women like her was that a lot of writing about her and others available online usually omit these types of things from their stories. And they become heroes and role models and people that we should look up to. But we don't get this other side of the story in which their science and the science of their time was built on the exploitation of colonized people. And if we don't recognize that past in the heroes and role models that we are propping up, then those darker sides of science, those darker sides of history can be repeated in the present. And we felt that that was something that was really important to address throughout the book.
Yeah, and I think one of the important things about the chapter that Marion is in particular, is that we talk about the way that science itself was constructed as a kind of colonial imperial endeavor. You know, Charles Darwin, when he took his trip on the Beagle was a British Navy vessel, and the surveys that the British Navy and the French Navy and the Dutch Navy did all over the world, which uncovered all of these amazing natural treasures, and they often took naturalists with them on these surveys, were primarily intended to find new land to conquer, to add to these empires. And so one of the things that I think we spend a lot of time thinking about in this book is, if women are excluded in general from the kind of formal institutions of science, they can't go to university, they can't work in a lab, whatever. What are the ways that women find opportunities to pursue knowledge of nature? And one of the ways they do this is to kind of tap into this infrastructure of empire that affords them a way to travel around the world, to collect specimens, to make illustrations and sell books. And, you know, this is very, very much normal and very much a way that both men and women made their careers as naturalists and as scientists, by just kind of piggybacking onto this infrastructure of empire so that you can go anywhere and make these studies. And so that's part of a kind of larger thing that we explore in the book, is how women find these opportunities that are not necessarily available otherwise to study nature and to participate.
Yeah, and another group of women that we cover that found different ways to participate in science and pursue knowledge were the wives and sisters and assistants of scientific men. Their brothers or husbands usually had access. In this case, we talk about the case of Caroline Herschel. Her brother William was kind of the more famous of the pair. We talk about Lavoisier, her husband, Marie-Anne Lavoisier, her husband, Antoine, is known as the father of modern chemistry. And what we find when we look at the wives of some of these much more famous men was that these wives were constantly working in partnership with their husbands. And sometimes their husbands explicitly excluded them from being published on their works, but also when we're looking at the time period of something like the Renaissance, women just typically did not publish under their names. They typically did not publish their own works, and especially not in science. But when we kind of look past who authored what, we start to see that there was often partnerships of women helping their husbands, and sometimes not just helping, but actually authoring parts of their husband's work, setting up their observational tools for astronomy, setting up their chemistry labs, all sorts of things, translating works from other parts of Europe so that their husbands could read what was going on in the scientific world to participate in it. That these wives that we typically have just seen as wives are actually very integral to the development of science. And we don't always have records of those women because they did not get their own published works. And so that was another way that women could participate in science, was having a male relative or a husband that was a scientist in some way. And that's a really interesting group of women to look at. And, you know, outside of the Enlightenment, we are starting to see that with a lot of other women. Specifically Einstein and his wife. And lots of people are starting to understand that she contributed greatly to the theory of relativity. And so once we start to look a little bit more into these stories, we can really start to see that women have been at the heart of scientific progress, scientific inquiry, and discovery throughout history.
And one of the things we talk about in that vein in the book, in terms of like women leveraging opportunities and kind of finding a way in any way that they can, is that women in a lot of times and places specifically leverage the kind of restrictive gender roles of the places and times in which they lived in order to be able to participate in science. So in the 19th century, women are not necessarily going to university, except in very rare circumstances. You can't really do science as an amateur unless you're quite wealthy. But one of the ways that women found to enter the scientific world in that period was to write books, specifically books that were aimed at other women and at children and educating children about science. And I think the interesting thing about that story is that women specifically wrote these books in ways that aimed them at other women. So it became an acceptable thing for them to do because it was fine for women to teach other women or children about science. That's what women are for, right? To teach kids how to do stuff. So you have this huge explosion of women popularizers of science in the 19th century because it's a job that you can do from home while still taking care of your family. It's seen as sort of morally acceptable because you are educating children. And in many cases, the way that this science education is conveyed is in a kind of natural theology way, where we're learning about nature because it's a way to understand the perfection of God's creation. So it becomes acceptable in a religious and moral sense as well. And then there are these concurrent changes in the way that we're publishing books at this time, which become way cheaper to publish books. We have better presses and cheaper papers. And so the volume of printed material in this period basically just explodes. And women jumped in there and capitalized on this moment to make careers for themselves. And some of them became quite famous and wrote some of the best-selling books of the 19th century in England, for instance. So looking at these ways that women kind of navigated all of these systems is really important to us. Instead of just looking at the sort of canonical history of science and saying, well, there doesn't seem like there's a lot of women here, and you know, women weren't really allowed to do stuff, so I guess there's nothing to say here. Taking that next step and digging a little deeper, you find women everywhere who are like clawing and fighting their way to get into these systems, and they're doing extraordinary work in order to do that.
Yeah, and one of the things that with our work with this book and the work that Anna and I have been doing together for several years now is when we look at the way science has been done through the experiences of women, we find that science has been done in a lot of ways that we would not recognize. Women doing science in their homes because that's where they were allowed, socially accepted to be. We find women who were not university trained, like with the anthropologists and archaeologists who still went out there and excavated and made a way for themselves. We find women who did science, like I said, with their husbands and brothers, but never got credit. There's all of these different ways that if we look at the way science has been done through the experience and eyes of women, we start to expand our understanding of what science is, what it looks like, how it can be performed, where it can be performed, and also who gets to participate. It kind of explodes our stereotype of white men in white coats. And we start to see a very different and also a more diverse group of people contributing to our scientific world.
Yeah, so just to wrap up then, so we know that women have always pursued knowledge about nature. So I think that the task that falls to us now, and what we hope that we're doing with this book, is explaining and understanding the structural and institutional forces that have stood in the way of women's quest to do this, and kind of submerge them beneath this stream of history that we traditionally think about. And a richer, fuller understanding of the history of science, we think, is gained by just tossing out the question of if women have been capable of scientific achievement, and instead we want to seek out and explain the forces that have hidden them from our view. We know they're there. It's just a matter of finding them and understanding why we couldn't see them before. And I think that this contributes to, better and more inclusive institutions for the future of women in science. And that's something that is really important to us as well, thinking about the future of an equitable science that serves everybody and taking into account everyone's contributions. And so we hope that the book gives you some idea of how that has worked in the long history of science. And yeah, I think that's all we have for you, but we would love to answer some questions.
All right, thank you all so much for that wonderful overview of your work. It looks like there are some questions popping up in the chat. Feel free to type your question there, or you can raise your hand, the little virtual hand, or your hand in the screen, and I will call on you. Okay, here's a question from Megan Bartles. How did you put these groupings of women together? Did you start with women and look for common threads, or start with the themes you wanted to explore and look for the women who epitomized them? Can you talk a little bit more about the gathering of information for the book?
Sure. We started with time period, so deciding how we were going to organize the book by time. We've got antiquity and Middle Ages. We've got the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and then the long 19th century, and then pre-World War II, post-World War II. And so we started with kind of groupings in that sense. And we really started more with contextual questions. So what was going on with science during this time period? What did science or medicine or technology look like in this time period, in this place? And then we kind of went from there looking to see what women were participating in that time period, in that context, and how. And from there, we were able to see connections between the way women were working in science based on their time period, based on the access of resources and things like that.
Yeah, and the book is very thematically organized. So there will be, in some chapters, women who lived in not vastly different time periods, but different time periods in different places and who did different things. But when we're looking at a kind of thematic issue like colonialism, for instance, which we talked about earlier, then we're picking up people who are, sailing as part of the British Navy or who are going to Dutch Suriname. And so those things are very different geographically or politically speaking, but we're talking about like a thematic connection. And we especially wanted to focus on that as opposed to kind of grouping people in other ways based on where they lived or something like that, because that does kind of stray into, I think, the like biography territory that we didn't necessarily want to go toward. What we're most interested in, I think, is exploring these big themes and placing women into these larger thematic chunks of history and showing you how they themselves were like fulcrum points in these big shifts or changes or movements in the history of science.
Okay, any other questions? It seems like so much of this time, discoveries of science in science are highlighted with a prize. So, right, someone like myself who just looks at science from a layperson's point of view may hear about someone winning a Nobel Prize, for instance. Can you talk a little bit more about how that has affected women in science as far as receiving prizes, how that has maybe changed over time, and if women are now better represented in the prize world in the sciences?
So that's interesting because we do cover the issue of Nobels in the final chapter of the book. And usually the big names who draw our attention are women who have won Nobels. Of course, everyone knows who Marie Curie is because she was the first woman to win one and twice. So, which is not to say that that's not extraordinary, but by focusing on women who win these prizes, that kind of put them on a level with men to say, look how good she is. She's just as good as men when it comes to science, is that when we lift up those singular figures who win prizes like the Nobel, we're really casting a big shadow over women who did science in different ways and who didn't make any less extraordinary advances, but were overlooked for various reasons. So one of the things that you'll see in kind of women's history of science as well is that women started creating their own prizes specific to women. So in astronomy, one of the prizes specifically for women is the Annie Jump Cannon Prize. And Annie Jump Cannon, who we do talk about in the book, was one of the female computers. Now we would just call her an astronomer, who worked at the Harvard Observatory at the turn of the century. And she created one of our still currently used, though adapted, methods for analyzing the spectra of stars. And she was an extraordinary woman, but was working in a low-ranking, low-paying job. And it has taken us a lot of time to recognize her as an astronomer and not just some woman who, I guess, like did the dishes sometimes and did a bunch of calculations. So the prize, the Annie Jump Canada Prize, was created to specifically honor women because women were being left out of other prizes where the awards mainly went to men. For a long time, awards were only given to men. And then once they became more gender integrated, women were still being left out of winning. And not because of ability, but just because of the same old systemic biases that we've been dealing with for a very long time. So the prize issue is very, it's complicated and it has a long history. And it does tend to kind of muddy the waters of who we see in the public as getting recognition and not getting recognition.
Yeah, and a slightly secondary issue to that, which we talk about in the book, is that there has also, in addition to the kind of like the Google Doodle bubble of the same women that everyone already knows about, we do love to talk about people who got snubbed or who we think got snubbed for prizes. And so someone like Rosalind Franklin, who discovered pulsars, her like PI on that project did win a Nobel Prize for it, but she wasn't named because she was a graduate student at the time. And one of the things that we talk about to kind of get into this complexity of this history of prizes is that, first of all, Rosalind Franklin has said publicly many times that she just doesn't care. And then she kind of wishes people wouldn't make such a big deal about it. And that she was a graduate student at the time, and she understands that there are kind of like norms about that. And that also when we spend so much time being like, oh no, this woman got snubbed, this one woman we know of who got snubbed, Rosalind Franklin is another one who I would put in that same category. A similar thing happens that we see with, your Marie Curie's, where we just spend so much time talking about the same figures, whether it's because they're so amazing and were awarded all of what they should have been, like Marie Curie, or because they were so amazing and they were snubbed by the Nobels. And it's kind of the same issue that we're spending time on these sort of high profile figures who are high profile either for good or bad reasons, and not looking at the larger history. And so that's one of the things that we really wanted to focus on in this book, is trying to get past those things. It's you can feel bad for Rosalind Franklin. She doesn't, so maybe you don't need to, but also there were lots of other women who have done amazing work like that, so that we can learn more about as well.
Okay, and here's a question from Elizabeth, a couple of great questions. Did you look at power structures within groups of women doing science, even if they were on the margins or as accessories to men? That's part one. And then second part, did you find that women were likely to share information and discoveries, or were they generally concerned with keeping their ideas proprietary? So first question looks at power structure, second kind of looks at intellectual property.
Yeah, so for the first question, yes, we do. So just because women are on the margins doesn't mean that power structures aren't operating there as well. And we see those, of course, in regards to race and class. And one of the things that we do look at is how, when women, for instance, in a chapter on early environmentalist movement, that women largely started as a group of white middle class women pioneering and advocating for community sanitation, better housing, things like that, food regulation laws. And the things that they were advocating for really overlooked the concerns and experiences of women of color, immigrant women, working class women. And so those women started to form their own groups that advocated also for things like community sanitation, food regulation, but in a way that spoke to the communities of which from where they came from, for other women who looked like them and had their same experiences. And so there are several places in the book where, even though we're looking at how women are operating on the margins, how issues of class and race, we're also playing out on those margins as well.
Yeah, and I'll just, to the second point of the question, I don't know that we have anything like really specific or kind of like data based on like how likely women are to share things versus how likely men are.
Yeah.
But what I can say is that it was always much more difficult for women to share their own research in public. Either they are not invited to become members of professional societies where research papers are presented, or in the case of Vera Rubin, who was an astronomer, she wanted to present at a conference, and her advisor told her, well, of course you can't do that because you have a child. I would be happy to present your research for you as long as I can put my name on it. She refused, obviously, and took her kid with her to the conference, and it was fine. But there are like structural reasons that women weren't allowed to share their research with the public in the first place. And so that's something that you have to consider, you know, above all else, is just how able are women even to participate in those aspects of science. Like doing it is one thing, and then being able to get your research out there and have other scientists listen to you and take you seriously, to get published, to be part of the kind of republic of letters of the scientific community. That's not something that it was available to most women, and is, you know, very difficult for women in certain time periods.
Well, and one of the things also with a lot of the women that we cover in this book, since they were working on the margins, a lot of them weren't necessarily, even if maybe they were interested in publishing research or discoveries or things like that, typically weren't allowed. Some of them had absolutely no interest. Some of them went in with the goal of going to medical college, to use that to serve communities, that they were going to share their skill to save lives of the women in their communities. So they didn't even see that as it was a knowledge was a thing that had to be hoarded. It was something that had to be shared to save ourselves. And I think that's also another thing that's really interesting when we look back at women physicians, social workers, psychologists, and those in kind of what we would consider softer sciences, is that they are getting this knowledge in order to benefit a greater good. And so in that case, it's not really proprietary because that wasn't their whole point to begin with.
That's really fascinating, the science being done for almost as a community service. So that women were allowed to do it then because it was helping others. When do we see a shift, or have we seen a shift in women publishing science? Can you tell us a little bit about where we are with that now, whether it's in books or in scientific journals? Has there been improvement? What is the trajectory there?
So in the 19th century, when journals really started to become I guess, a cornerstone of a scientific field, science started to professionalize, and you started to get all of these more niche fields. You started to get chemistry being separate from biology, from being separate from botany, from like all of these things that we understand now as scientific fields really just emerged in the 19th century as what we recognize them as today. Along with that came the scientific journal. And that completely changed the way science was disseminated amongst scientists, but also to the public. That also really changed the way women could engage with science as well, because even though men, you know, they had been writing, Anna talked earlier about science popularizers of the 19th century, they dominated the popular press. There was a booming culture of science because women were publishing science that people outside institutions were reading. That completely changed once the scientific journal emerged. Most of that writing transitioned into the journal. But with the journal came a lot more gatekeeping of who got to publish. And that usually meant women did not get to. We started to see that changing after more women entered higher education in the 20th century. We started to see a much bigger shift around that, around mid-century, and a much bigger shift, obviously, in more recent times, women publishing in scientific journals. We do know that every year someone does some sort of like data mining of who's publishing in scientific journals and who isn't. Men are still publishing at a much higher rate than women. And we now know that there's a lot of disparities that contribute to that women are in the academy. They do a lot more community outreach work. They do a lot more mentorship. They're doing a lot more of those emotional labor things in the academy that men don't traditionally do or are not responsible for. Women are also still the ones who take care of children at a higher rate than men. All of those things affect how much output women are allowed to have in journals. And we obviously saw that during COVID. Women's publishing plummeted like 100% in scientific journals. So it has changed and it has evolved. There is still a lot more work to do on not just the structure of the scientific journal itself, but also on a much larger societal scale of what we expect of women and what we expect of men.
All right, here's another question. Why do you think it's important to deem someone's work not only important or seminal, but also scientific? And I think we're talking about why is it important to deem a woman's work as scientific?
Yeah, so I think this is something we talk about basically throughout the book, but there are a couple of chapters that are specifically focused on this issue. One of the things that our work together for the last almost 7 years has always focused on is expanding our definition of what counts as science, who counts as a scientist, who gets to do science. You know, we're both historians of science who are trained in a very formal academic environment where we have like a long philosophical debate about what is science. But one of the things that's really important to us is identifying those places where women are participating in science, are pursuing knowledge about nature, are employing the scientific methods of their time to achieve certain things, and looking at those and bringing them into the fold of the history of science. In part because, you know, before the 19th century, there really is no like familiar formalized conception of science. That's a modern invention. It's a fairly recent thing. So when we look at the past, the sort of deeper past, it doesn't actually make sense to really talk about science in that way. So when we look at people like midwives in Rome, you know, Roman midwives were like a profession. That was something that you did as your job and you got paid for. And there were norms and standards about how that job was done. And that's not very different, we don't think, from, you know, the 19th century professionalization of like being a physician, which is also a recent invention. So taking that as our starting point and kind of looking back, I think it's important to, this is going to sound bad, but to slap that science label on things, because it makes people think about these different pursuits that women had differently. So there's one chapter on the history of the space program where we talk about the women who worked at NASA during, you know, in the 1960s, and they were doing clerical work, they were secretaries, they were personal assistants, but all the women who worked at NASA in that early period had to have security clearances. They had to know what was on the documents that they were moving around. You know, they weren't empty-headed secretaries. They spent a lot of time researching about what was going on with the space program and the technology that was involved, and they were extremely skilled, and they basically kept the entire thing moving. And so at what point do we separate out a woman who was an engineer who went to engineering school, as a space worker, as someone who worked in the space program, who did a technological job, versus a secretary who has a top secret clearance and is reading all of these documents and doing research to know better about how to do her job and managing all of these schedules. And I think by collapsing those sort of hard divides, we bring more women into the fold, and we also get a better understanding of what it means to do scientific or technical labor.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note also that, like, we don't feel like we need to call the work that women do scientific in order to legitimize the work that they were doing. It's not a way to make women seem important. What it's meant to do is, like Anna was saying, kind of collapse our understanding of what science is and also expand it.
Okay, here's another one coming from Shannon. Thanks, Anna and Leila. I'm so excited to read the book. How complex was it to piece together these stories, given what I imagine is uneven evidence in historical sources? Were there some stories that you couldn't confirm in the evidence, but still hope to tell?
Yeah, so the main issue with having uneven evidence is in the antiquity and Middle Ages. And one thing to point out about antiquity is, yes, it's hard to find sources for women, but it's also hard to find sources for men because it was antiquity. It was a really long time ago. But we do have more of a dearth of sources on women in antiquity. And so one of the ways that we deal with that is to we're honest in the book about what we don't know and what we don't have, but also why we don't have that. And one of the things that we can do when there is a dearth of sources is that we can look at what we do have, what we know about the culture of science, technology, or medicine at that time, and we can start to build out a social world in which a woman who was practicing science or medicine, how they might have gone about doing that. And we are really clear in the book when we don't know something, when we are saying this is a very good educated guess based on what we have. And I think it's really important to recognize what we don't know. And we do that throughout the book. There were some stories that we could not confirm. There were some women that we realized exist only on the internet. We could find no actual historical evidence for some of these women. So those were some of the issues that we had in uneven evidence and how we dealt with that.
Yeah. And I think we are also, Leila and I are both trained as modernists. I'm a 20th century historian. Neither of us read Greek. There are limits to what we can do with the kind of ancient period, but also what Leila said is that there are limits to what people who can read Greek can do with the ancient period, because it was a long time ago. But I think being really clear about that in the book was super important to us. And like Leila said, that we did encounter some sort of apocryphal stories about women. And that just goes back to what we were talking about earlier with this kind of like the Google Doodle bubble, the kind of like media obsession with like the first woman to do this or the first woman to whatever. There's a Wikipedia page for the first Egyptian woman physician, Merit-Ta. Merit-Ta, in all likelihood, did not exist and was kind of invented. In the book, we write a little bit about some evidence from like grave goods from Egypt that there may have been women physicians. And we're just very clear that we don't have like a good handle on that. But we do, like Leila said, build out a kind of social world. So we talk about like, what did medicine itself look like in ancient Egypt? And then leave that, I guess, to you, the reader, to kind of like put that together. Like if a woman was practicing medicine in ancient Egypt, this is maybe what she would have been doing. And by the way, that would be making a little clay statue of a crocodile and tying it to your head to cure your migraine.
Sometimes you could put grain in its mouth to help like help with the migraine.
Helpful hints. All right, one last question that I have, being here in New Mexico, where we're, obsessed with all things atomic. Do you cover the women of the Manhattan Project at all, either in New Mexico or Tennessee? Could you tell us a little bit about women during the uranium times?
Yes, the uranium times. Yes.
That's what we should have called it.
On the Manhattan Project called What Cannot Be Unmade. And we talk about Leona Woods, who was the at that group of women with Enrico Fermi, who watched the first man-made sustained chemical reaction take place under the squash fields at the University of Chicago. And we do talk about just like the massive workforce of women that did the clerical work, who were turning knobs on things that they didn't actually have clearance to know what they were turning knobs for. There were women who operated computers. They learned from the ENIAC girls who were programming massive, those things that take up like an entire room and now fit into our houses, those old computers. But also when we look at some place like Oak Ridge in Tennessee, where a literal town was built to support the workforce of the people who worked on the uranium enrichment plants there. And they had schools for the children. They had their own newspaper, community newspaper. They had a hospital. They had a grocery store. They had all of the things that you could imagine, as well as the people who worked in the enrichment plants. And so one of the things we want to do in the book, in that chapter, is to show what a critical role the wives of these scientists played in building up the structure of Oak Ridge that made the uranium, that made the bombs. And that is, Leslie Groves, who was the general in charge of the Manhattan Project, said specifically in his memoir after the war, and after, there were clearances on some of this information, that they specifically sought out wives to help support the program. Because wives could do that kind of labor that supported the men to support this town, to support the making of the bombs. So we do have a chapter on that, and it covers the wide ranging roles that women played in the Manhattan Project, but also the role that women played after the war, as far as trying to kind of get the world to stop making so many bombs now. After the war, a can of worms was opened. We went into the Cold War right after that. You had islands in the Pacific that were being bombed by hydrogen bombs from Russia, United States, and England, and that was killing the native people of those islands. And it was also at that point, women who stepped in and said, hey, that's enough, maybe. You're contaminating our planet. And the work of Katsuko Sarashi, a woman from University of Tokyo, she actually advocated for international nuclear non-proliferation and succeeded in getting an international treaty signed about not exploding bombs in water and atmosphere. So yes, that was probably a lot longer answer than you were looking for, but it was a fascinating chapter to dive into. And I think one that might surprise people maybe the most about what women were actually doing during the Manhattan period era.